So a very warm welcome from my side. We want to start now because we are 10 minutes over time and we have a very good program. Only a few words before, we have translation into German, English, Portuguese, Spain and French. So if you use this one of the language, you can do it on your seat. My name is Martin Häusling. I'm one of, with my colleague, organizer of this conference, Majdouline, and our third part from the Green Group is coming later. It's Metz. And now I hand over to our colleagues from Brazil. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Martin. So I'm going to speak in Portuguese because it's my mother tongue. I would be more comfortable. Bom dia.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for attending. And I'd like to start by thanking Martin for hosting this extremely important event. I'd also like to express my thanks to MEP Majdouline with us and MEP Metz, who isn't here at the moment but will be arriving shortly. Thank you for hosting this event. Thank you for making it possible for this event to take place. Well, this is a conference where the main goal is for us to move towards an international legislative framework for pesticides. Because we know that international conventions on the subject exist, but they're insufficient to cover pesticides. Pesticides are only a part of the substances covered by the Basel, Stockholm and Rotterdam Conventions. And there's no doubt that from the regulatory viewpoint, we need specific rules for pesticides because of their effect on human health. They affect a large percentage of the world population. The WHO reckons that more than 200 million people have been contaminated. A high percentage of people die from this. And it's important to take into account that the world population isn't affected equally. The population of the Global South is more affected than the people living in the Global North. And within the Global South population, the coloured population, the indigenous population, women and children are all the most affected by pesticides. So there's a huge amount of asymmetry and imbalance when talking about the effect of pesticides. And we see substances that are banned in some countries, such as the European Union, primarily the European Union, because you've got more than 260 substances that are on the banned list. But then you have the rest of the world that continues to use these substances. So there's an imbalance in terms of substances that are authorised in different countries. There's an imbalance, too, about the residue levels from substances that remain in water and in food. In Brazil, for example, the residue level of glyphosate in drinking water is 5,000 times higher than that's permitted in the EU's drinking water. So these are just examples that I can give. So before I pass the floor to the panel members, I would just like to pay tribute to a major partner, friend, Anopotek, who can't be here today because of health problems, and very much a reference point for this subject, a member of the network which is Pesticides and Justice. He's a source of great inspiration for us and also someone who works tirelessly for this course. So I'd also like to thank all of the activists, all of the people who've worked so hard to make it possible for us to hold this event today. And there's Mr. Dupre as well, who's worked very hard on this subject, both here and in other international bodies. Having said that, yes, sorry, were you wanting the floor? Please go ahead, Serge. Microphone, please.
Então, bom dia a todos.
Good morning, everybody, and I'm going to be speaking Portuguese as well, as it's my mother tongue. It's a great pleasure to be here in the European Parliament, taking part in this conference. As we've heard, the goal is for us to make progress towards and work on having a systemic approach amongst all the institutions that are working for us to have an international regulatory framework for pesticides. And I would just like to thank the European Parliament, IPSA, the Lisbon Institute. I'd like to thank CIRAT, the International Centre on Water and Transdisciplinarity. I'd like to thank the Brazilian Federal Public Prosecutor's Office and the Prosecutor's Office of the Ministry of Labour, as well as Fatima, all of whom have been partners and have worked together to ensure that we could hold this event. I'd like to thank everyone, therefore, that made it possible for us to hold this event here today. Just to set the background, really, we have this alliance of which is IPSA, which is the International Pesticide Standards Alliance, and that brings together the world of academia, activists, and as well international bodies. And gradually, IPSA has managed to build links with the International Pesticide Action Network and others, as well as to draw links with institutions across the world. And that's an achievement of IPSA, which was launched at 2003 at a UN conference. There was a technical cooperation agreement agreed on there to link in all of the organisations and bodies that are working together to ensure environmental justice and to ensure proper regulation on the use of pesticides across the world. And I'd also like to stress that IPSA is also working together with Brazilian ministries and organisations looking at water quality as well, and is bringing together specialists and politicians to look at all of the angles and components and dimensions that have to do with the use of pesticide and the impact that they have on the global south in particular. And I would also like to say that we also have UN representatives, Marcos Aureliana, for example, who's going to be taking the floor after me, who's the rapporteur for toxic substances and human affairs in the UN. I understand there's going to be a remote speech, and the rapporteur for access to water from the UN is also going to be giving a lecture during this conference. So these are experts from the UN system, and there's going to be a Brussels Charter as well, which hopefully will help us to set out the next steps that this alliance will be taking so that we have a global alliance against the use of pesticides or the unregulated use of pesticides. And that's what I wanted to say now. And now I'll pass the floor to the next speaker. Thank you.
Microphone, please.
So we try again.
Colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Marcos Orellana. I am the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights. I am very pleased to have the opportunity to join you in the opening of the second conference towards an international regulatory framework for pesticides in this virtual manner. And I look forward to joining you in person for the closing tomorrow, Friday. Please allow me to make three observations at this time. Firstly, it is most fitting for the second conference to be hosted at the European Parliament. This is because the European Union and its member states have a special responsibility to ensure that their measures and policies do not result in serious and foreseeable harm to human rights. And that is precisely what results from the export of pesticides that are banned or restricted for use in the Union. The result, human suffering that is widespread and severe. Secondly, the venue of the second conference towards an international regulatory framework for pesticides also reflects the critical importance of EU leadership in this area. We're seeing positive steps taken by countries like Belgium and France, but of course much more needs to be done to transform the pledges of the EU chemical strategy for sustainability into concrete legal action. In this regard, real leadership is not devoid of cost, but it is driven by principle. And in the context of pesticides, the prevention of exposure to hazardous substances for the protection of human rights that are compromised by such exposure. Thirdly and last, it is most appropriate for the conference to speak to an international regulatory framework for pesticides. And that is because this issue concerns shared responsibilities between exporting and importing states. Exports of prohibited pesticides are a form of discrimination that involves odious double standards. And at the same time, imports of hazardous pesticides often result in a violation of the importing state's duties to protect fundamental rights. To conclude, we must face reality. Exports of prohibited pesticides result in harm to the life and health of people in the weakest link of the food supply chain. Poor farmers and children in the fields of the global south suffer the brunt of the export of prohibited pesticides. To put an end to this situation, the European Union's leadership is indispensable. I wish you a most fruitful discussion and look forward to seeing you in person tomorrow.
May I give you the floor?
No. So thank you very much. We have technical problems. We have no translation, but sorry, it's not the first time in the Parliament that we have technical problems. So we work hardly to maybe if tomorrow is in person here in the conference, so it can be better. So I make my speech in German. The translation. Ja, nochmal ganz herzlich.
So once again, a very warm welcome from my side on behalf of the Green Group in the European Parliament. Very briefly about myself, I'm an organic farmer. I work on my farm in Germany. I've been organic since 1988, and even then I wasn't using pesticides, even before I went organic, but in Germany now, 10% of our farmers are working pesticide-free, and we hope to increase that proportion further. We are discussing today the question of international regulation of pesticides. This can have enormous impact. Just a few days ago, we've reached an important stage in the Mercosur, EU-Mercosur agreement. It hasn't yet been finally ratified, but we're concerned that all of this is going in the wrong direction because it will actually facilitate the import of pesticides to Mercosur countries, and we do not think Mercosur is going to lead to tougher regulation. So in what I have to say today, I want to focus on the question of EU authorization because Europe likes to congratulate itself on its regulation and likes to say that this could become a global standard, but Europe isn't a yardstick either for tougher regulation in this particular instance. Just the fact that we were not able, as has been said on several occasions, to stop pesticides that are banned in Europe being exported elsewhere. There are certain big companies in Europe, Bayer, BASF, of course, first amongst them, who export these pesticides. We wanted to ban this, the German coalition government wanted to ban this, but under pressure from the industry and also the liberal coalition partner, all of this made it very difficult to actually stop them exporting. But I would like to say on behalf of my group that we cannot accept, if we take our standards seriously in Europe, we cannot accept the export of these pesticides. After all, it comes back to us in the food we import, and there's the whole question of maximum residue levels, limit values, and so on. And of course, it's not going to be very reassuring to European consumers if, we set strict standards at home, but then we import high levels of pesticides afterwards. So the whole procedure for authorising these pesticides in Europe is full of holes. Cocktail effects are not tested. The formulations are not potentially analysed. It's only the active substances. And when you look at the question of neonicotinoids, until about 10 years ago, we thought they were totally harmless, and now we find out that bees are losing their sense of orientation as a result of this. And of course, nobody analysed that, nobody looked into that. So that wasn't included in any test procedure or assessment procedure. So you can't rely on the assessment procedures. The situation is, we've got this wonderful new active substance. It has no negative effects, no harmful effects. So it's authorised, and then 10 years later we find out that it has much more harmful effects than we had imagined at the outset. And in Europe we have EFSA. They were supposed to authorise these active substances. And with glyphosate we had a huge debate. And EFSA relies purely on the analyses of the industry. They check that those analyses were carried out correctly, but they don't look at alternative analyses. And I'm not so sure that you can totally rely on what the industry produces to justify the authorization of its own substances. And we have tried to regulate on this question. In the last Commission, the aim was to reduce pesticide use by 50% in the European Union. We thought that was good, and we supported that proposal on sustainable use of pesticides, but unfortunately the initiative didn't go through. It failed, unfortunately, because of massive resistance from lobbies, including agricultural lobbies, but also the chemical industry, and the argument that people kept bringing forward, and maybe you'd like to say something on this, was that if we don't have these pesticides, we're all going to starve to death. We won't have sufficient crops. We won't be able to produce enough food. And the whole question of world hunger, or feeding the world, was brandished as an excuse not to reduce the use of pesticides. And we do have strict regulations that aren't properly respected. Throughout the EU, the recommendations to use less pesticides are not being checked. One argument is that we should reduce the amount in terms of tons of pesticides used, but that's not the point, really. We should take into account how harmful the pesticides are and reduce the most harmful. And of course, first and foremost, we're talking about insecticides, the fungicides, somewhat under the radar at the moment, but we are seeing increasing use of those as well. So I think if we want to set standards, if we want to set yardsticks in Europe that are going to have an impact on the rest of the world, we need to strengthen our own regulation. That's without doubt. In Europe, we do have negative pesticide effects. In Germany, we've seen that there's an increase in Parkinson's, which is recognised as an occupational disease amongst farmers linked to the use of pesticides. And this has been known in France for a while. There is probably a number of people who are affected by Parkinson's that we don't know about yet, because the farmers have to prove that their Parkinson's is caused by the pesticides. And we need to change that. The people who are affected, the people who are suffering the effects of this ought not to be the ones who have to prove themselves what the cause is. It should be the pesticides producers that have to prove that it isn't. Anyway, I think the burden of proof should be reduced. But as a farmer, I would say, of course, we need to promote organic farming, to prove that there is an alternative. I'm not saying we can ban all pesticides tomorrow, but there are alternatives, and we have to give more support to the organic sector, which can manage without. If we invested 95% of the funds that go into conventional farming that relies heavily on pesticides, then we can't support organic farming enough. We've had a long discussion on the common agricultural policy, where measures such as crop rotation were promoted, with proposals to test and use alternative measures to conventional pesticides first before you use pesticides. These are all practices that we should promote. A few years ago, I was in Serrano in Brazil, near San Luis, where I saw for myself how pesticides were applied. Soya farming is a massive driver of the increase in pesticide use. And I saw with concern that we are massively importing soya into the EU in order to feed our livestock, our chicken farms, our pig factory farms, are making massive use of these imports. So we share responsibility for the massive use of pesticides in the global south in order to import our animal feed ingredients from there. So I think we also need to address that. Anyway, I don't want to say more. I have other colleagues who want to speak, but Europe has a huge responsibility in all of this, and I think we should be doing more to call for international regulation. We shouldn't allow ourselves to be driven by deregulation mania that we're experiencing in Europe at the moment. Everybody's saying, oh, cut down red tape. Farmers know what to do. We don't want all of these rules. But no, we need strong rules. We need a strong scientific sector that can control all of this. And we need an agricultural sector that makes responsible use of all of this, and that and a general public who are critical about it all. So I think we need to do a lot of work. And I think this conference can play a part in that, can be a step forward to stronger regulation and to understanding that we need to pay more attention in Europe to what is happening in the global south. Thank you.
Muitíssimo obrigada.
Thank you very much, dear Martin. I'll pass the floor now to Majdouline Sbai, MEP, for her thoughts. Thank you very much. I'll be speaking in French. Unlike Martin, I'm not a farmer. I don't have that experience. But I'm an environmentalist, and for 25 years I've been active in environmental circles. And this is a subject that's been at the heart of our debates. And although I'm a town environmentalist, because I've been active in Nord-Pas-de-Calais in the north of France, I've always been involved in countryside and farmers' associations protests. There's a kind of paradox today when we hear about anti-environmentalist approaches and arguments. There's a kind of paradox here, because just a few years ago, we were the only people to be talking about food sovereignty and having a food policy where people can live in a dignified fashion. And obviously, there was José Bové, there was Benoît Biteau, Jean-Louis Rabera, Michelle Rivasi, who all of you knew, and you knew her commitment, and we have Martin now. We have political figures who are extremely active on this subject. I also wanted to say that France is the largest agricultural country in the EU and is also the largest user of pesticides in the EU. And this kind of use of pesticides and the intensification of crop production, well, this isn't really living up to expectations. 20% of farmers in France are below the poverty threshold, and the number of farms has gone down by a quarter in France over the last 10 years. And we have people that don't have access to good, healthy food or proper food. So again, not meeting expectations, and that's not taking into account the public health aspect. Unfortunately, we are lagging behind on data in this subject. The public health agencies that are supposed to register the impact on human health of such substances are not doing their job. An example, we did local tests, maybe because parents were worried about their children's health. We noted, in fact, that the residue levels were higher than were authorised, and we were seeing clusters of child cancers as well and child diseases at a much higher incidence level than in other areas of France. This became clear when there were local tests carried out. Marie Toussaint, my colleague, she said all of this, and that we needed an ambitious European policy, that we couldn't leave parents without any kind of reaction. And yet, we were told that the data that had been collected was false, was fake. I'm sure you've all seen the film Goliath, and that is one that was made by a French farmer who ended up dying from the diseases mentioned by Martin. So we're in a situation now where people have to prove that they are sick because of exposure to pesticides. And as things stand, there's no requirement that the companies that market these substances prove that they are not responsible. As things stand, if you look at the chronic illnesses, more serious illnesses, and what they cost to treat, 18 billion euros per year if you take the whole of the EU. I'm not going to go into the figures in detail, but in France, the insurance companies have themselves calculated that were we to change the regulations on pesticides and reduce exposure, then the costs of what they have to pay out would go down by 90%. And then drinking water. There's a part of my area where I come from where people cannot, in fact, drink the water because of the pesticide use in the area, which has leached into the soil and the water. So I know that in Germany a study was carried out in Munich where they said actually that an organic salad was less expensive by a factor of 17 times if you were to internalise all the external costs of non-organic food. So, if you take the case of France, there is legislation whereby we've made progress, the Galine law. Unfortunately, there are shortcomings in the law and loopholes which companies have, of course, taken advantage of. They don't export pesticides per se anymore. Instead, pure chemical substances are exported. And that's been the case in 2022, in 2023. And two companies in particular are responsible for exports of chemical substances, BASF and Corteva. They say people will lose jobs if they don't export these substances. Not true. And there's around 714,000 tonnes of substances exported from France every year, more than 90% of which are banned in the EU. The ECHA has said that the exports tend to be the most hazardous substances. And in Brazil, they've carried out studies of the impact of the pesticides on children. I know you'll be hearing about this during these discussions. And more than 10,000 children are in a similar situation to children in France and in Europe. That's going to get worse with Mercosur. The Commission published a study itself showing that pharmacological tests are insufficient in Brazil, and with the intensification of imports from that area, we're going to be more exposed than we are now. Let me conclude with European legislation. You've been, I know, keeping a close eye on this. There has been progress made in legislation, and that's thanks to the efforts of environmentalists for the sustainability of pharmaceutical products with the SURE regulation. And you know that, in fact, the Parliament played a role there. Having said that, there is a commitment to ensuring that the chapter to reduce primarily and ban the export of substances banned in Europe should also be put into law. We're fighting for that. We're fighting, too, to raise objections in the ENVI and Sant committees to ensure that the thresholds for MRLs for imported products are not increased. And that struggle shows that we are, in fact, threatened with reducing public health protection levels in Europe, and the Commission's involved in that. Having said that, thank you very much for organising this conference. I wish you all the best. We can have a very strong organisation between researchers, NGOs, companies, citizens, who are increasingly worried about this subject. Anyway, we will be supporting you in your struggle. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much. I'll now pass the floor to Renato Roseno, who is a Brazilian Member of Parliament, State Deputy of CIRAT. He is an activist for environmental causes and in particular against aerial spraying, which is the main way of spreading and using pesticides in that area of Brazil, aerial spraying. You have the floor, Renato.
Ok, obrigado. Bom dia.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. My name is Renato. I'm a human rights lawyer, and I'm a state deputy in Ceará, in the northeast of Brazil. And I'd like to thank Larissa, and I'd like to thank Sergio from CIRAT, as well as members of Parliament, Majdouline and Martin. Thank you very much for the invitation that IPSA, CIRAT, the MPT, and the MPF have extended to us to attend this conference. So I have here a presentation. Next slide, please. Brazil is one of the main users of pesticides on the planet. In 2010, we used 360,000 tons of pesticides per year. But that's gone up to almost 800,000 tons. 90% of these pesticides are used on 5 crops: soya, forage and pasture for cattle, maize, and cotton and sugarcane. In the last 3 decades, as a contrast to this, there was a fall in traditional food crops, i.e. cassava, beans and rice, which were a part of the traditional food culture in Brazil and Latin America. And that's due to the agribusiness industry's pressure to produce agricultural commodities that can be exported. So now we're exporting soya, maize and sugarcane, primarily to North America, but also to Europe and also to China. In particular, when it comes to soya, which is used then for animal feed for pigs. An absurd number of pesticides that are used in Brazil are banned in the EU. So talk about double standards. So substances banned by the European Union for their own use are exported to Latin America, to the global south. Of the 10 pesticides that are most used in Brazil, 5 active substances are banned here. And it's absolutely vital we know that. Next slide, please. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about CIRAT, which is an estate in the northeast of Brazil. It covers an area of almost 149 million square kilometres, 9.2 million inhabitants, and it has tended to produce tropical fruits, which then get exported to the European Union. And so if you have Brazilian fruit in Europe, chances are it may come from my area, from a port from my area, going to Rotterdam, to Antwerp, to other ports, as well as to North Africa. So melons, bananas, mango, watermelon, papaya, they're all produced in my region, in my state. Exporting fruit is like exporting water and exporting work, because we are actually exporting something that now is being produced by large companies producing just one crop and using huge amounts of pesticides. We have also a situation where, as I said, we import pesticides banned by the EU in Europe, pesticides which don't pay tax when they're imported into Brussels. They tend to be exempt from tax. Next slide, please. Martin and Majdouline already mentioned situations. We have similar situations where we have serious intoxication and contamination of the population, particularly clusters of child cancers, also malformation, and also the bringing on of early puberty as well. In areas where we've had aerial spraying by major companies of pesticides. And we've also got water pollution. A study carried out by the Federal University of Minas Gerais actually concluded that most of the main aquifers in the area are polluted and contaminated. So, pesticides banned in the European Union are imported into Brazil. They're used in aerial spraying. They leach into the soil. They leach into the water. They cause cancer. They cause diseases and illnesses to produce fruits that are then exported, to the global north. Next slide, please. Now, there's been farmers and countryside movements against all of this, of course. Family members of people that are affected, huge social movements that I'd like to pay tribute to. And they have actually been fighting against what they call poisonous rain. And we had José Maria de Tomé, for example, who was a leader against aerial spraying, who was in fact murdered, shot 18 times because of what she did. And agribusiness in Latin America basically acts with impunity. And it actually does have recourse to murder to protect its interests. The people that murdered Luisa Maria de Tomé have never actually, the people that decided on the murder have never been brought to justice. The people that carried out the murder were in fact convicted. Now, her family and the area where she worked actually developed a campaign against aerial spraying, and they actually call this the 21st of April movement. That was the date where she was murdered. And they tried to ensure that there would not be aerial spraying over farming land. Now, 8 years after her death, we did manage to get legislation through, which we call the Maria de Tomé law. And that actually prohibits aerial spraying in the state of Ceará. Now, out of the 27 states of Brazil, we are the only one that has managed to ban the aerial spraying of pesticides. And unlike the dire predictions of agribusiness, we didn't see a fall in the production and yield of fruit or export of fruit or losses of jobs. Next slide, please. So the arguments put forward by them were wrong. Nonetheless, the agribusiness is saying that in the courts that the legislation needs to be struck down because it in fact reduces free choice. So the legislation is in fact under threat, but it does still exist. And the Supreme Court in Brazil did say that in fact the legislation could stand because it protected human health and the environment. It was a huge struggle though, to ensure that that was the case. The number of people that were involved, researchers, science was a major ally of ours in proving that it is necessary for us to have an agri-environmental transition. And of course, this is something that the agri-chemical and agri-business business is hugely against, particularly those located in our area. Next slide, please. But in the years that we were fighting for this legislation, 2.2 million litres of pesticides were sprayed aerially across the area. So just to give you an idea of the scope of what we're talking about, But when we moved to not using pesticides in aerial spraying, production did not suffer. So, and that's the point I would stress. The arguments put forward by agribusiness are wrong. Next slide, please. So now we have new threats that we are facing. What we're facing now is the threat of what they call precision agriculture, which is using agricultural drones. Using drones for agriculture is something that we have seen being rolled out very quickly in the area. The drones can carry 20 litres to 60 litres, 100 litres, 200 litres of liquid substances, and China is developing even larger ones. So we are actually looking as well at larger and larger drones being applied to the extent that they almost become planes, really. And the argument we're hearing is that drones are more targeted than planes, but increasingly, as the capacity of drones goes up, the difference between those and small planes becomes less and less. That's the point we're at now. We are up against a lobby of the drone-producing companies, major companies. We need help internationally. We need support internationally to act to ban these drones, which are aerial spraying by another name. So, our stand against pesticides. What have we managed to achieve? Well, first of all, what do we want to achieve? We want to ensure that in the global south, anything that is already banned in the global north or Europe, anything that is banned there is banned in the global south too. Our bodies are no different to northern bodies. We are affected similarly. We need to do away with these double standards. Who suffers the most with the current standards, double standards? Well, indigenous communities, the coloured communities, women and children. So we need a campaign, but it needs to come from the global north. It's therefore vital that we talk in the European Parliament about the fact of, in fact, moving away from these double standards, from this hypocrisy. Substances that are not actually allowed here are used to produce fruits and other products that are then actually consumed here. How absurd. Now, unfortunately, Brazil is under a great deal of pressure in the parliament from the agri-business lobby to deregulate, to relax the legislation that, in fact, we do have on pesticides. There's a great deal of pressure, and there's no point in the global south countries carrying the burden of tax from agribusiness, because the public health system in the global south pays $28 for every dollar of profit of the agribusiness company on treating the health results of the use of pesticides. So we need an international regulator, I would say. And the final point I'd like to make is the fact that we actually managed until the end of the last century to, in fact, live without the massive use of pesticides. We really need to speed up a transition to a much greener, much more environmental agricultural system. We need to not only take into account climate change, we need to, in fact, ensure that climate change is mitigated by moving towards a more sustainable system. This is why we have an agenda for change where we are, in fact, working with networks for environmental justice. We're calling for an end to these double standards. And as such, we would call on colleagues in the European Union, in the European Parliament, international organisations, the European Parliament, please work to ensure that the Mercosur EU agreement is not going to lead to greater social and environmental injustice. Last week, there was a meeting between the President of the European Parliament with members of Mercosur. If there is an agreement between the European Union and Mercosur, this agreement needs to protect human beings, traditional crops and the environment, full stop. Thank you.
Deputada Tilly Metz.
And Tilly Metz has just arrived. So,
is yours. Okay, vou passar a palavra.
Okay, thank you very much. Bom dia e muito obrigada.
Well, good morning, and thank you very much for that presentation.
For being late, but as co-rapporteur of the animal transport, I had to be in the Agri and Transport Committee. But now I'm here. I'm very happy to be here. For me, it's inevitable to talk about the One Health approach when we talk about the use of pesticide. As some of you might know, I am a member of Envi, Agri and Sun committees. So I really try also to implement this approach in my day-to-day work and to push the Parliament to intensively work on the successful implementation of this concept. The concept of One Health emphasises the interconnection of human health, environmental health and animal health. To structure my speech, I want to briefly come back to all the three areas. It is particularly relevant when examining the impact of pesticide, as their use can have significant consequences across the three domains. So let me start by the human health. There are two main issues: the direct exposure of agricultural workers and also the risk of residues in food and water, which has a direct impact then again on the consumers. Pesticide use causes neurodegenerative diseases and cancers, which farmers are the most exposed to. In particular, the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a cancer widespread among regular pesticide users. Not long ago, the non-Hodgkin lymphoma has been recently classified as an occupational disease of farmer and agricultural workers in France and is now recognized by also the health insurance system. But only in France and Italy recognize officially Parkinson's disease to be linked also to farm work. This should be the case in all EU member states and, of course, also outside the EU. The cost to human health of pesticide use amounts to 1.6 million unintentional poisonings per year in the EU, and we continue being exposed on a daily basis. According to the IPSA report of 2022, about 41% of fruit and vegetables tested still had detectable pesticide residues, and 23% of the samples contained multiple pesticide residues, creating potential health risks from their combined effects, which are not yet adequately regulated. Another concrete example of the exposure: in France, 20% of the people live in regions where drinking water shows pesticide residues above the legal limits at least some of the time. And in Vienna, a study measured 17 different pesticides in the air. This shows that we are constantly exposed to these chemicals, not only on an individual basis, but also to entire cocktails of different active substances. Children are particularly vulnerable to pesticide exposure. The connection between children's exposure to pesticides and diseases and disorder occurrence in early childhood and adolescence is now well documented. Why? Because children eat and drink more relative to their body weight than adults, and therefore they can be exposed to a higher dose of pesticide residue per kilogram of body weight. And also for babies, there is a high risk since they crawl on treated lawns and carpets with pesticide residues from the air, so the pesticide rub their skin and they breathe pesticide-laden dust. Maternal and paternal exposure to toxic agrochemicals are associated with greater chances of children being born with congenital malformation. So it is really crucial that the overall impact will be better researched and included in authorization procedure for pesticide in the EU, and the reduce of pesticide is drastically reduced to avoid exposure and therefore health-related risk. Second aspect is the environmental health. It concerns mainly the soil and the water contamination, meaning that persistent pesticide can degrade soil health and contaminate water bodies, affecting both terrestrial and aquatic ecosystem. But there is also the big issue, and you mentioned it certainly already this morning, the issue of biodiversity loss. The widespread use of pesticide can lead to decline of beneficial species such as natural pest predators and pollinators, contributing to ecological imbalances. At a time where our world is at the edge of a biodiversity collapse, harmful pesticides continue to be used. In Germany, for example, the population of insects in protected areas has declined by 75% in 30 years. 50% of the entire grassland population of butterflies has disappeared between 1990 and 2011 in the EU. Around 40% of all flying species, insects worldwide, are threatened with extinction. But insects, as you all know, are very important for our food production as pollinators. And the loss of pollinators poses a threat to agriculture in the long term, but the use of chemical pesticide further contributes to their decline. Besides, 80% of soils in the EU are already polluted with pesticide, which could affect their fertility and productivity. From a biodiversity protection point of view, as a conclusion on that point, it's clear a reduction of the use of pesticide is inevitable. And briefly, also, let me talk just a few words also on animal health, one of the aspects of the One Health approach. So pesticide can harm non-target species such as the pollinated as bees and aquatic organisms, which can lead to disrupting ecosystem and food chains. And also animals grazing on pesticide treated lands or consuming contaminated water may experience health issues, including reproductive and developmental problems. So to conclude, some suggestion, business as usual is not an option. If we want to protect biodiversity and the environment and human health, ensure food security and and the income from the farmers on the long term, and if we want to take the implementation of the One Health approach seriously, we need more agroecology, and this has proven to be more economically efficient, and it was also now mentioned by our guest here. Reducing the use of chemical pesticide and hence the cost is farming common sense. Every euro you save is one you can invest in the future. And we need to improve biological control, authorization and implementation of integrated pest management. So we need an ambitious reduction of pesticide. We have the farm to fork strategy, we have the biodiversity strategy, and we need to reduce by 50% the use and the risk of chemical pesticide, and as well the use of the more hazardous pesticide by 2030. So sustainable use of pesticide regulation would have been the tool to make this reduction reality. So I deeply, deeply regret, and as my colleagues also, this withdrawal by von der Leyen in February 2024. So I didn't want to have to justify, I don't want to have to justify to the future generation in a few years that we have let them down because we have not managed to take sustainable action. That's why I will, together with my colleagues, continue working towards a drastic reduction of the use of pesticide. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigada.
Thank you very much, MEP Tilly Metz. Well, I think now online we have Saranjani Rangam from the Pesticide Action Network Asia Pacific. So you might need to use headsets to hear better. So, Sarojini, thank you so much for joining us.
I would like to ask you when you need, I don't know if you are yourself changing the slides. If not, please, you need to tell our technical people to the next one, please, next one, if they are operating your presentation. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank the members of the European Parliament who have organized it together with IPSA and CIRAT and all the other co-organizers. I believe that we need an international regulatory framework for pesticides. And next slide, please. Why do we need a strong and international regulatory framework? Next slide, please. We did a study as PAN Asia Pacific. PAN is part of a global network that works towards eliminating the risk of pesticides and supporting agroecology and food sovereignty. We are all over the different regions, and we work together on this very important issue and objective of elimination. I want to just spend just to share with you about a field survey of pesticide use in 4 countries in Asia. And it's called Use and Impacts of Pesticides in 4 countries in Asia. We did it together with partner organizations, and they were 7 and in 4 countries. And, you know, the list is there. I won't go into details, but it's there for future reference. Next slide, please. So the summary of study, it was done between 2021, in mainly 2021, with 367 respondents who were surveyed. And this was part of a community monitoring action, to look at pesticides. And we had 52% men farmers, 46% female farmers. And most of them sprayed pesticides. So 80% were women farmers, 95% of the people who were surveyed were male farmers. And they said, most of them said that they use pesticides. And 70% of women in Bangladesh and Laos, they mixed and loaded pesticides without protective clothing. And 34% of women were washing pesticide-contaminated clothes and equipment. And 23% of women purchased and transported pesticides. So all levels, from the time they bought, from the time they mixed and loaded, to the time they sprayed, until they started to wash. And a lot of them also washed the equipment in rivers, which is a source of water, sometimes drinking water, for bathing, for cleaning, etc. So that's the situation. Next slide, please. Then the worst part is they also store, because they pay a lot for the pesticides. They pay a lot in terms of their income to buy pesticides, and they store them because they don't want it to be stolen or disappear. So 20% of them store pesticides in their homes, and 2% actually store them in the kitchen, and it's worse in Vietnam. Some of them even put it in their bedrooms and keep it high because they didn't want the children to touch or be exposed. So they put it on a high shelf in their bedrooms. And then we have the situation of decanting. So 20% decant pesticides, and this rose to 78% in Laos. They use that, they buy big containers and then they decant it to smaller containers to take it to the fields for spraying. 73% said that they were not trained on pesticide use. They don't even know the hazards. Nobody told them. In some cultures they still call it medicine for the plant. So it's a very unaware population with very little training. Then they field entry after spraying. 27% said they entered the fields on the same day pesticides were sprayed, and therefore their vegetables and their crops are still, having the pesticides, on the what do you call the leaves, the fruits, everywhere. So again, they are exposed when they enter their fields. Health symptoms. Most of them said that, like for example, of women farmers and 37% of men farmers using pesticides in Bangladesh, India, and Vietnam say that they have symptoms of pesticide and have to go back and and Lao, they said they did not want to respond to questions on symptoms of illness, and that's because I think there are many reasons, but that we did not get information from Lao farmers. Next slide, please. So of the 36 pesticides found in the 4 countries, we found 75% are highly hazardous pesticides, and many are widely banned in other countries. So these are, for example, chlorpyrifos and many other highly hazardous pesticides. 100% of the pesticide being used in Laos, in Bangladesh and India, and 60% in Vietnam are highly hazardous pesticides. They have always done also mixtures, so they get a few pesticides and they mix it so that it would be more for them, kill all the insects and everything in the fields, because they don't really understand the field environmental situation in their to use pesticides. And 60% in Vietnam were highly hazardous pesticides, because Vietnam has tried to ban the class 1 pesticides in use, and so class 2, WHO class 2 pesticides are used, but some of the chronic effects are still evident because of the highly hazardous pesticides. In terms of personal protective equipment, in all the 4 countries, farmers were saying that they do not use PPE during pesticide application because the weather is so hot and humid that they can't. They say that it's not, possible for them, either that or it's too expensive or it's not available. Bangladesh reported the highest proportion of non-use. And so when we questioned some of them, they were using, the PP, the the mask that we use during the pandemic. So which is not, it in no way can help even be some kind of protection. So that's the situation that we did in 2022. We will have another 4,000 respondents, and we expect that we will have a similar situation next year when we summarize the impacts and the use of these pesticides. Next slide, please. The second study, this was slightly older in 2018, but we did 2,000 farmers in 7 countries, and 70% of them said they suffered acute pesticide poisoning. And what we are seeing is that behind each of the numbers in the statistics is a woman, there's a man or child that is suffering from pesticide poisoning, and that most of these are farmers and workers in the rural areas, and they're often very poor. So this is a situation where the brunt of the impacts are being felt by the poor, and in countries where political clout is a bit diminished because of, these are the poor sectors of the country, and often they're workers and farmers that don't even have resources, even land and access to other resources. And this photo shows a boy who's 17 years old spraying pesticides in Pakistan. And so this is quite common. The teens, the young people are exposed to pesticides. Either they are laborers, they enter the field after the spraying, or they are actual pesticide sprayers. And many women also spray pesticides, even when they are, beginning of their pregnancy. So again, exposing their future generations. Next slide, please. So this is the same study where we found in Asia, we said 70%, so 7 out of the 10 farmers suffer from acute pesticide poisoning. And this is a grandmother who was spraying a mango orchard, so you kind of have to spray the fruits which is above your head, no? So she became blind. And then her granddaughter, who was there when she was spraying, also suffered ill effects. And similar with the man farmer who also had the same problem with blindness. So this is just just an example of what is really happening on the ground in Asia. These are people who are being exposed as workers and farmers without any kind of information and training and protective clothing. Next slide, please. So we believe that, the pesticides that are banned in the EU and in Europe should not be exported, should not be used in developing countries who have little access to even PPE, personal protective equipment. So here, this is Polo. The incidence of occupational pesticide poisoning in 2017 by Syngentas Polo, which is diphenthioron. And this took place in the Indian region of Yavatmal. And it is in a far larger scale than previously thought. Because in 2017 it was small, but later when the documentation and monitoring took place, and according to the documents, the police recorded 96 cases of poisoning linked to Syngentas pesticide, 2 of which led to fatalities. And this is shown by exclusively accessed documents, yet the Basel-based agrochemical firm that Syngenta still sells its highly toxic product in India. And it's even right now, with all sorts of campaigns, they continue to sell Polo in India. Next slide, please. We believe that, when you said, can you feed the world without pesticides, we can replace chemicals with agroecology. And there's thousands of farmers in Asia who are practicing some level of agroecology, reducing their pesticides, even stopping pesticide and fertilizers, using other techniques. Next slide, please. And so agroecology can only thrive when there's substantial and reliable state support for production and extension services, especially marketing. So there has to be a steady domestic market that will absorb locally and agroecologically grown farm produce. And I think that's very important because it has to be a transition. I think there was a discussion about transition. It cannot be overnight, but it's possible because these are farmers who are doing it on their own with some small support from NGOs and CSOs and, people's organizations on the ground. This is a woman from Cambodia and this is a woman from Laos who are happy because they have suffered from pesticide poisoning, and then when they learned about agroecology, they are now growing vegetables in agroecologically or organic vegetables, and they have a market that is being provided by the mayor of the city and the support from the agriculture department. So they have been able to earn well and support themselves and their children and their families. So it's possible. Next slide, please. So these are my recommendations, because I believe that we need to stop the existing double standards among countries that are particularly detrimental to countries with weaker regulatory systems. Here you're talking about developing countries, least developed countries, and therefore we really need a EU-wide ban of the exports of banned pesticides and hazardous chemicals. I think not only will EU lead the way, but also I think a lot of the corporations that are producing these pesticides and making lot of profits from this impacts on rural people, health impacts and environmental impacts are in Europe and of course North America. But a EU-wide ban would be a real I think will not only lead the way, but really protect human health and the environment, not only of the European countries, but also the rest of the world, particularly from the south. And we also like to say that, you know, we've been involved in this global framework on chemicals, and from there, this was, you know, that basically developed out of the CICM, Strategic Approach on International Chemicals Management. So their targets, there is an alliance, a global alliance, a resolution on a global alliance on highly hazardous pesticides. But it's a year now, and we don't see, you know, urgency. And we believe that we need this urgency to protect human health and the environment from pesticides. So we would urge the international community, with the support of EU and member countries, to work on a comprehensive framework to regulate hazardous pesticides throughout their life cycle, taking into account human rights principles. The other is to support phase out of highly hazardous pesticides, and I think replacing them with agroecology would be really important. And I think from the speeches that I've heard from the members of Parliament, European Parliament, you know, there is a commitment, and I hope that we can work together to move this forward. And then finally, I think we need to make the pesticide industry accountable to the pollution of the environment and the violations of people's right to a health and healthy, safe environment as well, and place strict liability on pesticide producers. Because again, no, the proof of burden, the burden of proof on health impacts is still on the poor farmers, on the agricultural workers, not on the pesticide industry, to show that they are producing pesticides that are safe. So always the burden or the proof of the burden of proof, is still with the poor farmers, who are still continuing to suffer from these pesticide impacts. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Saro. As we don't have enough time, I suggest that we invite Edmilson to come to give his testimony. And then afterwards, we can have the block of questions. If there is enough time, we put the questions together after the second panel. Okay. So, Edmilson, if you, por favor, venha para a mesa.
If you could come to the top table, please, so we can hear your testimony.
Acho que não.
Deixa
eu ver.
Já está funcionando.
Bem, então...
Well, thank you very much from Edmilson Costa da Silva for being here with us, from the Federation of Rural Workers and Family Farmers from the state of Maranhão, Fataima. And he's going to give us his testimony of direct experiences from the field and from his organisation. Thank you very much for attending. Good morning, or good afternoon, good morning. My name is Edmilson Costa da Silva. I'm a family farmer from the state of Maranhão in the northeast of Brazil. And I'd like to start by expressing my thanks to you for organising this event, this very important conference, and making this open to us. I'd say this is a portentous point in time. We're moving towards something that will save human lives, particularly the lives of children, which my association has been working for this for some time. I come from an area in the south of the state of Maranhão My parents were family farmers. Everyone in the family is family farmers. And we're also in a conservation area in the state of Maranhão, one of the largest in the country. I'm the director for my federation of family policies, and we also work with the Agri-Environment Agency, and we have an ongoing campaign against pesticides and in favour of life. Where I come from, as I said, I'm a family farmer in a conservation area, one of the largest in Brazil. And in this conservation park, we have livestock that feeds thousands and thousands of people. And unfortunately, though, the pastures are becoming contaminated, primarily by pesticides. I think all of us are familiar with benamine, which is a chemical substance. It's a poor area, and what we have seen is that our park has actually changed in terms of the number of people living in the park. Unfortunately, though, we are also seeing our population being affected by very serious health symptoms because of the use of pesticides, with vomiting, with people being sick, with people having to stop working. And we're seeing this in all agricultural areas. And there's a project that was instituted in our area and other areas too, where we are trying to get data on what's happening, because the agri-businesses are killing us off. Whenever we try to fight against the use of pesticides, we find ourselves threatened. We're also seeing deforestation. We've also got indiscriminate use of pesticides in and around our communities. This kills people every year, particularly children. But the pesticides are also killing flora, fauna, biodiversity, and our biome too. Now, people tend to think we're just a part of the Amazonian ecosystem, but that's not true. We also have the Cerrado and various other biomasses and ecosystems, all of which are being affected, the whole of the population, human and otherwise. Now, unfortunately, the people that tend to get blamed are locals, as has been said about the burden of proof. We need to work further to safeguard our area. Our area has, in fact, been studied to a certain extent. There's been research that's been carried out by different universities, and 211 communities have been affected by pesticides that have been spread by drones and by aerial spraying. And then as well, there are areas where people are just dying as a result of the exposure to contaminants, to pesticides. And particularly in the period where we have to use controlled fires to clear crop areas. And that is when people are the most affected, where fish die, where animals die. And this is because of indiscriminate use of these pesticides. And public policies are lacking in that there's not enough inspection, there's not enough enforcement, there's not enough training on how pesticides that are authorized should be used. And this leads to huge social vulnerability and also leads to more insecurity and food insecurity and poverty. And more damage to the environment. Some examples, not just from my area, but from the whole of Maranhão, suffering from a similar situation in 2021, 2022. An Arasa community, a traditional community, found children who were contaminated through aerial spraying, and children with burns on their bodies. And one of these children, Andre, had very serious burns on the body and still suffers the consequences to this day. And pesticides were sprayed over a school in 2023 when the children were actually were out playing, and they were all affected very seriously. And 2024, traditional communities in Baixa Nova, Vara Nova, Capinhão, Santa Vitória, all of them are in the Chibi de Maranhão area, and they were affected by aerial spraying of pesticides by drones and planes. And this was over crops such as maize and cassava, but led to serious intoxication. Various members of the community had to be brought into hospital. They had burning eyes, they had headaches, they were vomiting, they had burns on their bodies. On the 27th of September of 2024, the community, like the Benulag, Agua Branca communities, and San Jobanjit in Agua Preta, all of these were affected similarly. And they said drones were spraying pesticides over people, plantations, animals indiscriminately, and in particular over people. So there was huge levels of exposure, and this one person who was affected was suffering from serious asthma, had to go into hospital. Drones and planes are actually being used as a kind of chemical weapon too, to get people to leave their land, because what we're talking about is small farmers up against agribusiness. Small farmers tend to be much more environmentally friendly. In Maranhão, we've had hundreds of cases of intoxication through aerial spraying by drones. Amongst the social groups affected, we're talking primarily about traditional communities. We're talking about areas with an agrarian lifestyle. And in 2022, glyphosate and 2,4-D were the products most used in Maranhão. And around 16,000 tons of those were used in 2022. And people from Kahaka and Balanchi died in 2024 as a result of conflicts between their community and agribusiness. They said they didn't manage to throw us off our land. There is resistance. For more than 15 years we've been fighting with agribusiness. They come in, they burn our houses down, they contaminate everywhere we live, and now they're poisoning us. And so much, they're poisoning us to such an extent that we can't stay in our houses. That's been the case for the last 5 years. They're trying to get us to leave our land, and they are trying to ensure that there's a psychological as well as a physical and chemical battle against us. There was, in fact, a study carried out by a human rights agency which did, in fact, also state something along these lines. It said that it's impossible to, in fact, judge how many times pesticides have been used as a kind of a chemical weapon, and I do consider this to be serious pressure that's being exerted. It's something that is unprecedented, and this agency said that we are being forced to leave. It's important to stress that Maranhão, as I said earlier, is in one of the largest agricultural areas of the world where we in fact produce soya and we produce maize, and these conflicts are not being settled by the Brazilian state because they want the production of soya in our area. And if you have a look at the logistics, ports, roads, etc., all of this has led to land grabs of private agencies, private companies, as well as, to a certain extent, the state. And in the state of Maranhão, between 1990 and 2008, the area planted with soya grew by over 6,000%. Maranhão is the national champion of the use of bismuth in the area, and all of that has consequences. Maranhão also has the most conflicts in the countryside, and the number of cases of intoxication through aerial spraying is ridiculously high. We've seen a climate of violence recently. We've seen human rights activists killed and threatened. And at the moment as well, we have people who are receiving threats on a daily basis. We have around 217 municipalities, but over 90 of them experience serious conflicts in that area, with violence being unleashed against families and traditional communities. The violence is brutal. And if you denounce this fact and the chemical war underway there, then you too will receive threats. Recently, a university professor, a lawyer, was in fact threatened as a result of his activism. And he actually was trying to prove that aerial spraying in Maranhão was affecting local communities very seriously. Now, we know that this is the case. There are so many lives of local communities which are under threat because of aerial spraying. And this is something that really needs to be criminalized. The people responsible need to be taken to court. It's so absolutely important, therefore, that we have this conference, because this is a subject, if we manage to take it forward, will save lives. And the pathway to progress is through family farming. It's through environmentally sustainable farming. And that's why I'm here and grateful to be here, because pesticides kill, and we are trying to save lives instead.
Então, nós vamos agora...
Okay. Now we'll move on to our second panel discussion for our conference. And I would like to thank all of the members in advance and ask speakers to come up to the top table, please. Now, there's a couple of people who are panel members of the second panel who will be giving their comments remotely. I think Michael Edelstern from the University of Edinburgh and Fernando Bejarano as well from Mexico will be online. We also have Professor Andrea Rosa from the University of Cape Town, We've got Peter Häusling from Pesticides Action Network Germany. We also have Paulo Teixeira attending remotely, the Minister of the Agrarian Development of Brazil. So, anyone that is in the room, please come up to the top table, and if not, just please make yourselves ready.
Nessa ordem ele vai ter que ser o penúltimo.
Depois do Peter.
Isso. E quem tiver que falar, tem que falar the next slide. The next. Acho que tem que...
Peter. Ok. Por favor. Oi. Nice to meet you. Sit here. So, Peter, nice to meet you in person. Okay, perfect.
Does the presentation show anywhere?
Yes.
Yeah, the guys from the IT, they put it.
But will I see it on the screen?
Yeah, you see this screen here.
Okay, so I don't need my laptop.
No, you don't need it. You just say next.
Well, as long as I can see it. Otherwise I can't speak to
No, they appear in both
Otherwise
televisions.
I have nothing to speak to.
Okay, my friends, so let's continue our conference towards an international regulatory framework for pesticides. I'd like to thank once more the presence of the people that is here in person in the European Parliament. Also, lots of people that are participating online through YouTube. I would like to register that the morning part of the conference is going to take place here in the European Parliament, but in the afternoon we are going to shift the venue, and there is the address here in the entrance where you can see the address for the afternoon, just for an information of all the colleagues that are here in person. So let's continue the conference with panel 2. I'm speaking in English. I'll go forward this way. On the impacts of pesticides and scientific perspectives. So I would like to welcome once more Professor Larissa Bombardi. Professor Larissa is from the University Libre de Bruxelles and also the curator of the conference and also a member of the International Pesticide Standard Alliance. So Larissa, you have the floor.
So thank you so much, Sergio, and all the audience which are here or listening to us online. Eu começo a minha...
I'd like to start my presentation with the title of my last book, which is called Pesticides and Chemical Colonialization. I think the title sets the tone, really, that people in this conference will be familiar with, that in fact we are talking about chemical colonialization when we talk about pesticides. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
Yes, sim. Bem.
Okay. Throughout my presentation, as I speak, I think it will be very clear why I use such a strong expression as chemical colonialization. This graph shows sales of pesticides globally and the companies that market them. And you can see how much those sales were worth year by year. as you can see, they've just gone up and up. Next slide, please. Here, you've got the total sales of pesticides of the top 12 companies from 2017 to 2020. Short period of time, but an increase in sales of 27%. So after everything we heard from the first panel discussion, think about the impact of these substances. And think about a 27% increase in the use of these substances across the world. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Now here you can see a map. It's an anamorphosis. That means it's been deliberately distorted to an extent, showing the exports of pesticides from, and if you look, Europe there is slightly distorted because of the percentage of exports of Europe. Obviously, China is seriously represented on this map too, because ChemChina too bought Syngenta, which used to be Swiss. So Syngenta is Chinese now, and that's why as well China is represented on this map in the way it is. And you can see the size of and the share that European countries have. Belgium, small European country, but look at its share. Next slide, please. And here you've got world sales by country. And if we add the volume of sales of pesticides of the EU countries, that's actually almost the double of the sale of China's exports in value terms. Next slide. When people look at anamorphoses on the use of pesticides in the world, well, look at this. You've got South America standing out here, and in particular Brazil and Argentina. Next slide, please. And here you have a graph that shows pesticide sales in the European Union. Sales in Europe, and you can see over the last 10 years, those sales fell a little, not very much, around 3%. That's a long way from the goal set out in the Green Deal of the European Union and the Farm to Fork strategy. But people do see this small fall. Next slide, please. And here what you have is the same time period for Brazil. And you can see quite clearly just what the difference is. And if you just think of 2011 to 2021, which was the period that we covered for the EU, in the same period where the EU had a fall of 3%, we had a 70% increase in Brazil. So what does that mean? It means that this whole volume of pesticides that are produced in the world, well, if their use isn't going up here, it's going up elsewhere. And that elsewhere would be the global south. Next slide. Here, you've got the number of banned pesticides per country. And you can see it's quite clear if you look at the larger circles, which is the numbers of banned pesticides, and you've got a clump around EU countries. So, as I said at the start of this conference, we've got the Rotterdam, Basel and Stockholm conventions. But they're not up to dealing with the issue of pesticides. Now, the EU has regulation of its own, with the most restrictive legislation in the world for the EU. And yet, even despite the problems we heard about from the MEPs, the European Union has the strictest legislation, but really the actual situation can sometimes be a bit different. But I think if you look at the legislation as a starting point, it's clear we need international legislation. The rest of the world is lagging behind seriously. Next slide, please, in the number of banned substances. Here what you have is a map that shows the countries that import neonicotinoids that are banned in the EU. And in fact, we did hear from Tilly Metz about pollinizers being affected by neonicotinoids. That's why they're banned in the EU. But as you can see, EU continues to export neonicotinoids, and one of the main export destinations is Brazil and Mercosur countries. Next slide, please. Now here, Majdouline mentioned France was the first country in Europe to adopt a decision on banning banned products. And this is an article from Le Monde newspaper. As Majdouline said, there is a loophole. The multinationals managed to find a loophole to continue exporting their substances. So they don't export finished products which have to be labelled, instead active substances from the EU. Next slide. And here you have the main destinations for the exports of pesticides which are banned in the EU from France. Once again, you've got Brazil at the top of the list. But you've also got other global south countries, all of which are circled on the left, as you can see. So again, you've got this asymmetrical, unfair law, and it just perpetuates the colonialist relationship that we've been experiencing in the rest of the world for the last 300 years. Next slide. Pesticide sales in Brazil. You've got the top 10 sales of pesticides in Brazil. And if you look at which ones are banned, 5 of them are banned in the EU. So amongst the most sold pesticides in Brazil, 5 are banned in the EU. And that means we're not talking about something minor here. We're talking about a structural system, how conventional agriculture in Brazil is in fact using these products. And basically, we're talking about banned products in the EU being used in Brazil. So continuing with our analysis, I'll give a very clear and specific example. Obviously, looking at the historic and geographical differences during the colonial period in the 19th century, mid-19th century, for example, Europe was discussing labour relations and conditions for the workplace. At the same time, we had companies that were marketing all kinds of practices that were becoming banned in Europe, but they were being used in the global south. So you were talking about labour conditions in Europe. We still had slavery in the global south. And we've still got oligarchies carrying on the same work of colonialisation. So at the moment, what we're seeing is a perpetuation of colonialisation, where companies market substances that they're not allowed to use in Europe, And they work with oligarchies in the global south to perpetuate this. And that's why I say we're experiencing chemical colonialization, a form of perpetuation of the imbalances and inequalities, where these companies continue to sell substances banned here. Next slide, please. Let me give you the example of atrazine. And this is the fourth most sold substance in Brazil. It's been banned in Europe for 21 years because of problems for human health, stomach cancer, fetal malformation, for example, and it also causes problems with cells in the liver. Now, that's enough to show, I believe, the seriousness of the use of this substance. Next slide, please. And here I've got a map that shows the increase in the use of atrazine in Brazil. And you can see that the area of Brazil where the use of atrazine grew the most was the Brazilian Amazon. Now, I know you're concerned about the Amazon with the deforestation in the Amazon. Internationally, that's an issue. But we've also got the chemical use that's being used there. The different substances being used and their effect on human health in that area. Immense problems. And also, atrazine is considered to have an effect on the environment as well, because it disperses into water very easily. And it's also continued to be a chemical castrator of frogs and toads. So, massive use in the Amazon area of this banned substance. I'm sorry, this is chemical colonialization. Next slide, please. Now, I know glyphosate has already been mentioned, but just to make it clear, this isn't just a minor example. This is proportionate. This shows the limits of glyphosate allowed in the EU on the one hand, and the limits of residues of glyphosate allowed in Brazilian drinking water. Now, I know we're going to have more discussion about this later on by one of our speakers. This is and should be a subject of huge concern. Imagine if your drinking water had 5,000 times the levels of glyphosate in it than it does now. That's the case in Brazil. So for a child, think about what a so-called tolerable level is in Brazil, and think about that in proportion to a child's body weight. And if you extrapolate that, and if you extrapolate, therefore, what a child can, in fact, tolerate, well, there is no tolerable level for this substance. So children are being subjected to extremely high levels of glyphosate. Next slide, please. And here you can see a map of people who've been intoxicated by pesticides, more than 56,000 a year over the last years. And the Ministry of Health does calculate actually that for each person that was in fact diagnosed, there were probably at least 50 that weren't diagnosed. And I don't want to take up too much time. Next slide, please, therefore. Babies intoxicated by pesticides too. Next slide, please. And pregnant women poisoned by pesticides. Imagine the risk to children. They haven't even been born yet. Next slide, please. Indigenous people poisoned by pesticides. People most affected by intoxication by pesticides, indigenous people. Next slide, please. And here we have number of cases. We've already heard the number of indigenous communities and areas that are being criminally intoxicated by pesticides used as chemical weapons in land conflicts, in land grabs, to try and expel these people from their land so they can continue with their commercial crop growing. Next slide. Here you have a child that was intoxicated, and she comes from an indigenous community, and the name of the substance is Native, would you believe, produced by a company in the European Union. And this substance is made up of 2 HHPs, highly hazardous pesticides. So with this photo, I think this just does make it extremely clear that we are seeing people that are thrown off their land so that monocrops can be grown to be exported from Latin America to Europe using chemical substances. Apart from the physical violence and threats, we've also got chemical violence underway. So international regulation is more than necessary because we've got an environmental and a humanitarian emergency underway with this use of pesticides and the way in which agribusiness has organized itself in the so-called modern age of humanity. Thank you.
Agradecer, então.
Thank you very much to Professor Larissa Bombardi from the Universitat Libre de Bruxelles and IPSA. Continuing with panel 2, well, hopefully we can now connect with Professor Fernando Bejarano from the Network for Action Against Pesticides and its Alternatives from Mexico. And perhaps we can now pass the floor to Professor Fernando Bejarano. I understand we have a video that was recorded and will be transmitted now.
We need to put our headphones.
Yes, we still can't hear.
No?
O áudio não está funcionando. The audio is not coming. If it doesn't work, then I go to you, and then I try to put him back, okay?
Okay. Yeah.
Vou alterar, vou colocar a Andrea. So, my friends, we are having some technical problem here with the recording for Professor Fernando Bejarano. So, I will do a small adjust here in order that we have a flow in our panel. Then I would like to invite Professor Andrea Rotter. Professor Andrea Rotter is an environmental health academic. She's the head of the Environmental Health Division in the School of Public Health at the University of Cape Town, and an honorary professor in the Department of Public Health, Environment and Society at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She's also a member of the International Board of the European Partnership of the Assessment of Chemicals, and provides technical advice for several United Nations initiatives related to pesticides and other issues. So Professor Andrea, it's a pleasure to have you here. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I was very grateful that I could squeeze it in. I arrived last night in London, so I'm very pleased to be here. You know, we've heard a lot about agricultural chemicals and their effects and impacts in agriculture. And we have a bit of a crisis happening in South Africa at the moment, and I've been asked to speak about the crisis. And before I go into it, one of the things I just want to remind many of us is about the whole tobacco industry, and that for 50 years, the tobacco industry kept saying that tobacco was safe and didn't cause lung cancer. And they used a playbook, and that playbook is being used now by the pesticide industry. And some of the key things in the playbook was the sowing doubt or denial, undermining evidence, influencing research, owning the message, and shifting the blame and responsibility onto others. And that's what I want to talk about today, is what has been happening in South Africa in terms of the shifting the blame. And how could international regulation help with picking away at the playbook, but also this blame? Next slide. So what's been happening in South Africa? So in October, we had 6 children who died, and it was presented as food poisoning. So these 6 children died, and there was this huge outcry. It became evident that their food was contaminated with what was called rat poison, and immediately the industry started saying it was aldecarb. Now, aldecarb was used in South Africa illegally as a rat pesticide, so this is where the agriculture chemicals are starting to come into the urban environment. And so immediately the industry said it's aldecarb. And then the headlines were, how could a banned pesticide, it's been banned since 2016 in South Africa, how could this be then killing children? Then the narrative changed because they actually tested the toxicological testing of the 6 children who had died and found out it was turbophos. So turbophos is an agriculture pesticide that's still legal in South Africa, but of course it's being imported where it's banned in other countries. So the narrative then started going to the small shops that were selling the food that the children had bought. The talk was about it was food poisoning, and the blame went on to the shops. A lot of the shops are run by migrants, by people from other countries, Pakistan, and etc. And so the blame then was going on to these shop owners. And again, it was the industry that was driving this message. And so there were many of us who were trying to shift this narrative to say that actually it was many other reasons, which I'm going to come into now. So the government's lack of enforcement, and the industry getting away with things. And then finally, our president then actually declared a state of a crisis, a national crisis of this food poisoning, and wanted to have more and more committees formed in order to address this. Luckily, by the time he had his speech, we had been on, I think I gave over 15 interviews, where we were trying to shift the narrative to what really was the problem. And so next slide. So it became an inconvenient fact for the industry that actually it wasn't aldecarb anymore. It was actually turbophos that had been proven and has been legally registered. So if you go to the next slide. And we actually had done a paper that we published last year where we had indicated from mortuary studies that 29 children over the period where we had done this analysis, out of the 50 where there was toxicological analysis done, had died from turbophos. At the beginning of the year, I was sitting on a committee for a multi-stakeholder committee on chemicals management, where we were looking at the PIC notifications and where we were discussing the notifications for importing different pesticides into South Africa that are then banned in other countries. And I, at that stage, said there's a crisis waiting to happen with turbofos. This was in February. And again, the industry who sit on the committee as well said it's aldecarb. And they kept pushing the narrative back to aldecarb because that was easy. It's a banned pesticide, blame it on that. So if you go to the next slide. So we have this blame game that's been going on between the shops, there's this food poisoning, and then the industry. So why is the industry moving the blame all the time onto a different narrative? Well, they're protecting their shareholders' interests, and we've heard already this narrative of, we need pesticides for food security, which hasn't actually been proven. They continue to sow doubt and deny the facts. There's been an interesting narrative that's most recently come out. I'll talk to it in a minute, that we talk about street pesticides, which are agriculture pesticides being decanted, and they're shifting the narrative to calling them street poisons. They won't use the word pesticides. They've also come out to say that it's criminals. They've blamed the northern countries. So South Africa is bordered by several countries, and we do have porous borders. However, all of the northern countries have banned, all the SADC countries had banned turbofos except for Botswana. Botswana was the only one who has now just banned it. And then, again, blaming aldecarb. Next slide. So in 2008, I started doing research on street pesticides. I had originally been doing research on agricultural use and small-scale farmers being poisoned by pesticides. But it came to my attention that agricultural pesticides were easily accessible in the cooperatives and in supermarkets, and people were buying these, decanting them, and selling them in urban areas. So we have townships, we have informal areas. And then the question is, well, why? Why are people using these pesticides that were then killing children at that stage? Next slide. So we have conditions that people are living in urban areas that are very good for pest infestation. So we have lots of rats and cockroaches, flies, bed bugs. And the commercial products, obviously because of resistance, are no longer effective. And so communities have been looking for resources that would then kill the rats. So next slide. And this is a child I photographed who, at the age of 2, had been bitten by rats. Rats are a huge problem. Next slide. And so street pesticides became a big issue where legal pesticides were being decanted and sold. You can see at the top, is it your left, where they're sitting in a market, a mother and a child, and you can see the 3 bottles in the back that look like milk. Those would have been most likely methimidofos or chlorpyrifos that would have been decanted and water added to it. And when I took the photograph, the strong smell of organophosphate was almost unbearable, and yet the mother and child were sitting all day with these products. We do have a second type of street pesticide, which is prepackaged products coming in mostly from China, acephate and different kinds, but those aren't legally registered. Next slide. Again, just to show you how these are packaged. So people go into cooperatives or they buy them from a middle person and then sell the products. Next slide. So in 2008, we tried to test the chemicals. It was very difficult. It's difficult to find a laboratory that will analyze a product where they don't know, they don't have the standards for what's in the products because they don't necessarily know what it is. So we used a lab that was exporting and doing residue analysis. And they did about 20 samples, and then they said, that's it, no more. The concentrations are so high, you're ruining our machinery. And it's also our workers, our lab technicians are complaining because, of course, they were organophosphates. So then if you click on the slide, there should be another, yeah. So in 2019, we tried again to do some. So we did a mix of getting mortuary results Actually, we get better data from mortuary results, unfortunately, although it's difficult to get that data. But you can see the shift. Eldercarb was no longer showing up. It was turbophos. And so you can see the shift. But you can also recognize quite a lot of the pesticides that are banned, that we are still using and people are accessing and selling as street pesticides. Next slide. So just to indicate, so South Africa doesn't manufacture any pesticides. We import. We import everything. However, we do export. So we would export to other countries. So we may have banned, for example, endosulfan, but we continued for a while exporting it to Zambia, for example. So we also are participating a bit in the double standards, which I think is something that needs to be put on the table as well. The other thing is our Pesticide Act is from 1947. That's pre-apartheid. That we have an act for pesticides that is so old and antiquated that would then allow for all these cracks within the enforcement. Next slide. So what were we doing? One of the questions I'd been asked is, what were we doing or what are we doing to address this crisis? So we've been trying to change the narrative, which I mentioned. We've been trying to make it very clear that it is turbophos, that we are importing it. But we mustn't stop there. The conversation mustn't just be about turbophos. It needs to be about all highly hazardous pesticides. We have about 35 highly hazardous pesticides that we're importing at the moment based on the WHO FAO criteria on highly hazardous pesticides. And if we ban turbophos, we're just going to start seeing on the streets carbofuran or some other product that looks very similar. So we need to really talk about banning all highly hazardous pesticides. The other thing is you need to look at what's the problem. So our problem is that accessibility, you can walk into cooperatives and buy it, so you need to control that. But we also have a pest problem, a massive pest problem in the communities. And if you don't address that, then it's going to just continue. So we need alternatives. We need alternatives to pest control. And people need to know that you can actually control pests without pesticides. We need to do better data provision to our regulators. It was us that told the regulator that the northern countries had actually banned turbophos. The industry had kept saying to them that actually they were using it. The other thing is we have such a lack of resources. So we have a poison information helpline that has just closed its 24-hour service, ran out of funds, which means up to 200 cases reported a month are not then taken, the calls. And so it's really holding industry more liable to pay for a lot of these things as well. Next slide. I just wanted to show you one of the things that we had been trying to do. As I said, if you don't give alternatives, then people will continue using. So we've produced these little booklets. You can get them online, where there are recipes that people can produce with products that they have that are relatively non-toxic. Interestingly, because we've been pushing this, the industry's come out with a little booklet now called Pasela. Pasela is a little girl who goes around and tells the community that actually it's these street poisons that are killing people, not pesticides, and that pesticides are good, and we need pesticides for food, and we need pesticides for controlling pests in our townships. So they were very quick to come out and try and change the narrative. Next slide. So just sort of rounding up, one of the things I wasn't able to refine this data, but I just wanted to show you that from the PIC notifications that were done in November 2023 to South Africa. Now, this is a mixture of pesticides and chemicals, although it's mostly pesticides. Because of the regulations that are changing and the pressure that's happening in the EU, you can see that the countries have gone down who are actually exporting chemicals to South Africa. So on the left is from November 2023, and on the right was from November 2024. So there were less notifications that were being requested. So just to say that there is some movement. It's not enough, but there is some movement happening. So I think I've got one last slide. So, you know, from an international regulation opportunity, I think it's important, you know, we talk about that we need to stop the double standard, but I think we need to revoke the licenses of the companies that are actually selling the products. You know, they shouldn't be able to get a license if they're selling it to countries like South Africa. There also needs to be more opportunities and funding for alternatives. And I think we need to talk about, we talked about agroecology, but it's also important what's happening in the urban areas, that people understand that, you know, you can actually have alternatives. And the EU must continue this progressive approach that you've had of having more sustainable legislation, trying to reduce 50% pesticide use, because it does impact us. We do look to the EU, and when the EU regulates a certain way, it does impact on South Africa. And then to help change the narrative, change this narrative that we don't need to have pesticides for food security. We don't need to have pesticides necessarily all the time. So it would benefit us a lot. And I think one last slide just to say thank you. Yes, and that's our website if you'd like to get some of our resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Andrea Rotter from University of Cape Town, for your wonderful presentation. So let's go forward. We are going to try again the presentation, the recording from Professor Fernando Bejarano, de Red de Acción sobre Plaguicidas y sus Alternativas, RAPAM, de México. Please.
Thank you for the invitation. We are members of IPEN and the Pesticide Action Network in Mexico and Latin America. We will talk about highly hazardous pesticides and double standards in the exports from the European Union to Mexico. We are in the context of neoliberal policies applied in Mexico that have had negative consequences on pesticide regulation, had weakened government regulatory agencies in health, environment, and rural sectors, given priority to protect food exports to facilitate the entry of pesticides imported from other countries, and the harmonization of standards under trade agreements. High number of highly hazardous pesticides are registered in Mexico, and many of them are banned in other countries. Efforts by the former Andrés Manuel López Obrador government to change pesticide regulatory policies, like the phase-out of glyphosate, had faced strong opposition from pesticide industry and agribusiness. On December 3rd, in an open letter signed by 200 organizations, we asked the new government for a state policy that promotes the phase-out of highly hazardous pesticides and scale up the agroecological transition of agricultural systems initiated in the last 6 years. The pesticide market in Mexico is an oligopoly dominated by transnational corporations. As you can see in the graphics, and all the graphics in this presentation are taken by the Pesticide Atlas. Transnational corporations based in European Union, Bayer, who also own Monsanto, and BASF, are a key actor players in the Mexico market. These companies, plus UPL, Corchiva, and FMC, concentrates 53% of total sales in our country. The pesticide residues in Mexico above the European Union maximum residue limits are present in the domestic market. In one of the studies presented in this graphic, the green color represents the percent with samples with pesticide residues in milk, spinach, lettuce, tomato, chili, and a highest percent of them are with above the maximum residues limits of the European Union. The pesticide monitoring priority is to protect food exports and non-national consumption. 21 of the highly hazardous pesticides with most sales in Mexico are banned in other countries. You can see in the graphic that covers herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides, including, for example, glyphosate, glufosinate, or chlorpyrifos, or other pesticides like mancozeb. One of the examples of double standard is paraquat. This paraquat was introduced in UK in 1962 as Gramoxone by the Imperial Chemical Industry. Now Syngenta, that's property of Chemsec, a state Chinese company, covered 25% of worldwide sales, was banned in UK in 2007 but exported to Mexico. China banned paraquat for vegetable production since 2016 and is the principal world exporter for Syngenta and other Chinese companies. Paraquat dichloride was banned in 58 countries, including in the European Union. Cyanamide is another example. Registered in Mexico as synthetic growth regulator, is toxic, causes severe burns to skin and eyes, suspected of causing cancer, suspected for damage in fertility for the unborn child and damage to various organs by chronic exposure. It's also endocrine disruptor chemicals. BASF Mexican is the only registered by the health authorities with a trademark of Dormex. It's banned in the European Union since May 2008 for agricultural use and as a biocide since 2023. Imidacloprid is another example, banned in the European Union for agricultural use in open spaces since 2018 as neonicotinoid has a high risk for bee mortality. Bayer of Mexico has 10 registers, of which 7 have an indefinite validity. Producers and registers in the European Union are BASF and Bayer. And it's an example in the image. In the international context, we found this global framework of chemicals for a planet free of harm from chemical and waste. This global framework was approved in Bonn in 2023. It includes a global alliance of highly hazardous pesticides. This global alliance was originally promoted by the African Union and get approval of this conference, who includes representatives from governments, private sector and government organizations, and intergovernmental organization from the United Nations, and get supported by ministers all over the world in UNEA in 2024. Include a target by 2030 that government implement policies and programs to increase support for safer and more sustainable agricultural practices, including agroecology, integrated pest management, and the use of non-chemical alternatives. Includes also a target that established that by 2035, the phase-out of HHPs in agriculture. It is a voluntary initiative under FAO, WHO, UNEP, ILO, with a global support fund. Another relevant framework is the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, adopted in the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity in December of 2022. The objective is to halt and reverse the loss of biological diversity, to reduce the threats to biodiversity, with the reduction of the overall risk from pesticides and highly hazardous chemicals by at least half by 2030. Reducing pesticide risk can mean reduce the use and toxicity, and that includes also the increased investment and implementation of agroecological agricultural practices, including organic agriculture at scales that allow the goal to be achieved. So finally, we call to the end of double standard to stop pesticide export banned in the European Union, and we encourage the European Union to support the Global Alliance on Highly Hazardous Pesticides and the Kunming-Montreal Goal on Highly Hazardous Pesticides, and include them in the international cooperation agenda for Mexico and the Global South. Thank you for your attention. This is my webpage and contact information. Thanks again for your invitation.
Okay. So our register our gratitude to Professor Fernando Bejarano from Japan, Mexico, bringing his view and very interesting data on the issue of the pesticides in Mexico. And then going forward on our panel, I'd like to invite Dr. Peter Clausing. Dr. Peter is a toxicologist who worked inter alia 4 years at the US FDA National Center for Toxicological Research, and until retirement for 12 years in regulatory toxicology for the pharmaceutical industry. Since 2015, he is with the Pesticide Action Network, PAN Germany, but support other German and European NGOs with his expertise. He authored and co-authored 71 publications in peer-reviewed journals and 5 book chapters. So thank you for being here, Professor Peter, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much for the invitation. With a remark in the beginning, I was told that I have 6 to 8 minutes for the presentation. So adhering to that, my presentation will be relatively short. And I will be switching gears a bit, returning to the European Union after we have heard so many things about the countries in the Global South. And the title of my presentation is a bit provocative. It's not that bad, as we will see on the next slide, which is an excerpt from the Pesticide Atlas published by the Böll Foundation a few years ago, where we can see that there are 195 highly hazardous pesticides which are banned in the European Union but used in other countries. So from that perspective, using the legislation I mentioned, the 1107 of 2009, I think has helped quite a lot to get to this stage, which I think is a good benchmark for other countries. But nonetheless, I think we should also have a critical look at what is still not classified as a highly hazardous pesticide in the European Union, but perhaps should be. The most prominent example plays also a big role in the use in Latin America and other countries. As you all know, glyphosate is a big issue. Glyphosate would be one of these examples of failed assessments. We just a few days ago we as the Pesticide Action Network in Europe, with the Pesticide Action Network members of this Pan-Europe, and with Pan-Europe in the forefront, has filed a court case against the European Commission concerning the wrong assessment. But I will talk in the next slide about a couple of other pesticides. Before going into that, I think it would be worth just briefly mentioning what highly hazardous pesticides are, because we have heard a lot about HHPs during the last few hours, but maybe nobody has really looked at the definition which is given quite clearly by FAO and WHO. These highly hazardous pesticides are based on chemical properties. They are hazard categories, and they relate to acute toxicity on the one hand, defined by WHO, and on a number of long-term toxicological properties on the other hand, in particular genotoxicity, carcinogenicity and reproductive toxicity, which with a certain likelihood as being a hazard for humans are not allowed to be marketed in the European Union. So that's the background. And based on these criteria, I undertook a brief study in 2019, which I will use to explain where the problems in the European Union are. Next slide, please. At that time, I looked at 10 different pesticides, actually using the official criteria of the European Union and focusing on carcinogenicity classification assessment. In summary, and we will have a look at a few examples afterwards, in summary of the 10 pesticides, 3 of them were not valuable for me because of insufficient information provided by the European authorities. 3 of them I was in agreement, 2 already had been or meanwhile have been classified as so-called 1B carcinogens, and 4-chlorphenurin as a category 2 was also agreeable. And then we have, out of 10, of only 10 I looked at, we have 4 pesticides where I think, based on the European criteria, that they should have been classified as carcinogens category 1B. And without going into too much detail, I should mention that these classifications are based on long-term studies in rats and mice. And there you look at an increase of the tumor incidences, and then the assessment starts by a so-called weight of evidence, looking whether these increased incidences have to be taken seriously. And that's where the possibilities of different approaches to describe it neutrally kick in. And there is a number of criteria which are either reducing the emphasis of carcinogenicity or supporting the evidence. And one is statistical methods. There are different statistical methods that can be used. And very frequently used argument frequently used by the European authorities are historical control data to claim that the increased incidence in the actual study are not relevant. Using invalid or accepting invalid studies are in 2 of the 4 cases, in my opinion, a serious issue. It is strongly recommended that at the end of the study, of the 2 years, for instance, in rats, the mortality in the animals should be less, not less than 50%. And it's easily conceivable that towards the end, the number of tumors are increasing anyway, and therefore if the animals die for other reasons before they reach the end of the study essentially should be considered not as valid. And to be more precise, the OECD guidelines say accepting a study as a negative study showing that the substance is not carcinogenic should be with animals surviving with more than 50% until the end of the study. And then the mode of action, the mechanism of how the tumors are existing or created, generated, is one more aspect. Next slide, please. And this brings us almost to the end. I will focus on the two pesticides in the middle, Fosmet and Pyrimicarp. Both are studies with clearly lower survival at the end of the study than the required recommended 50%. The interesting part, I think, is that the studies which have been assessed in 2005 and again in 2022, or in case of Pyrimicarp, it's banned in 2022. One Fosmet has been assessed in 2018, Pyrimicarp in 2017, and there was no problem with carcinogenicity even at that time. So the studies themselves were in the early 1990s. In the 2005-2004 assessment, nobody was, of the authorities, was astonished that the survival was so low and the study was invalid. They even stated that the cancer assessment remained incomplete and that a final conclusion cannot be given. And similarly for Pyrimicarp, not being a problem for reapproving it, although we should keep in mind that the legislation with these cut-off criteria became valid only in 2009. But in the 2017 and 2018 assessment by the authorities, it was not much different. Like looking at the quote for Pyrimicarp from the 2017 assessment, it says, with the limitations in the historical control data on the one hand, and the reduced survival, this data alone is insufficient to conclude on carcinogenicity, which essentially is the job of the authorities to make an assessment. And yet, nevertheless, Pyrimicarp continues to be market approved in the European Union, and Fosmet has been banned, but not based on the carcinogenicity assessment or the lack of the quality of data. I think that more or less, we can have a look at the next slide. Yeah, this is my favorite, and this is my last slide. The previous assessment was in 2005, and in 2018, the responsible authority for the assessment was the BFR, the German authority, classifying diuron as carcinogenic as category 1B, and referring to the previous assessment as that a number of tumors had not been taken into consideration and other tumors had not to be taken seriously. So I think there's a lot of work and a lot of room for improvement for the European authorities, and a lot of work for us, because when these compounds become classified as 1B, they probably will still be exported to countries in the global south. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peter Clausing, for all the data and all the information you gave to enrich this conference. Considering we are very tight to the agenda, I would like to invite the next speaker, but before to inform that we are going to have space for just one or two questions. So if you have any questions for the lecturers from panel 1 or panel 2, please write it down, that we're going to read here and have this interaction moment. But now we are going to listen online lecturer. There is Professor Michael Edelstone. He's a professor of clinical toxicology and director of the Center for Pesticide Suicide Prevention at the University of Edinburgh. and consultant physician in the UK's National Poison Information Service, Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh. His work aims to reduce deaths from pesticide self-poisoning globally, a cause of over 110,000 premature deaths each year and a key global means of suicide. So, Professor Michael, you have the floor. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Could you please give me the first slide? Thank you. So this is a difficult subject to talk about, and so please be aware of this, and if this upsets people, please simply walk away, walk out and spend some time by yourself. The next slide, please. I'm going to start talking to you by telling you the story of Veronica. This is Veronica, a painting drawn of her when she was 14 years old. When she was 16 years old, she was living in a rural village in Sri Lanka with her family, and one day she was cooking dinner when her younger brother came in and started to annoy her. They got into an argument, like brothers and sisters often do. This ended up with Veronica hitting her brother with a broom. Their mother came in and scolded Veronica, consoling and looking after her brother and ignoring Veronica. Veronica left the room, and she returned shortly with a bottle of pesticide in her hand, and she told her mother, "I drank this." Her parents took her to hospital, but there was nothing the doctors could do, and she died the next day. Now, we don't know exactly what went through Veronica's mind at that time, but her parents do not believe she intended to die. They believe she intended to scare them. She used her first bottle she found and didn't know how toxic it was, and she died the next day. Next slide, please. Sadly, Veronica's story is not unique. I worked from 1995 in a hospital in Sri Lanka, and I've seen countless examples of people like this. People dying because they have access to acutely toxic pesticides. I've tried to save them, and I've failed. Some pesticides are so dangerous that there is nothing that we clinicians can do to save their lives. And the problem is not unique to Sri Lanka. It's a major global health problem, one that often gets overlooked. Since the Green Revolution introduced highly toxic pesticides into people's houses, there have been 14 million deaths. It's one of the most common causes of global suicide and accounts for about 20% of all suicide deaths. It's a particular problem in rural farming communities in low and middle income countries, where farmers and their families have easy access to highly toxic pesticides. They are not regulated like they are in many high-income countries and often sold in local shops without restrictions, then stored in homes and gardens. We know that in many cases, like Veronica's, there's very low intent to die. It's usually a spontaneous act at a time of distress, and in many cases, it's intended to be an act of self-harm, not a suicide attempt. So, next slide, please. So how do we solve this problem, and how do we save lives? That question has been the focus of my work for the last 30 years, ever since I stood on that hospital ward in Sri Lanka and saw people coming into hospital and dying in the hospital. As a clinician, my first thought was to find better treatments, but there have been no new treatments for pesticide poisoning in over 50 years. I started a range of clinical trials to find new treatments, but ultimately we had no success. Nothing I found worked. We had to work before the hospital. So then I got involved in a range of studies. But then this idea of safe storage. Can we store pesticides safely? But the problem is that's difficult, and it also blames the user. It says if someone dies, it's because you didn't lock away your pesticides. But it's very difficult to lock them away. And I still remember a photograph I have of a 12-year-old girl whose mother worked in the Middle East, whose father was an alcoholic, who was at really high risk of self-harm with pesticides. And every night, his daughter had to lock the pesticide away and then hide that key. And if that key had been found by her father, and if he drank the pesticide, and if he died, she would have been blamed for the rest of her life for not storing it safely. That's utterly inhumane and against human rights. We did a trial to test this approach. It was a large study for 53,000 households, 20-odd thousand lockable storage boxes, 223,000 people. We trained the farmers, but it made no impact at all. Locked storage did not stop people poisoning themselves. We're doing work at the moment to try and see if we can change how vendors sell pesticides. Is there a way of ensuring people don't buy it and then drink it? But I think we can say that's probably not going to work either. The next slide, please. There's one solution that is truly effective, and that's pesticide regulation and pesticide bans. About 20 years ago, I started to work with the Sri Lanka's pesticide regulator, who was also concerned about this problem, and has started to implement a series of carefully considered bans. We can see the results here. You can see that before 1950, the suicide rate in Sri Lanka, and this is all suicides, was running between about 4 and 5 per 100,000. The Green Revolution came along, and suddenly there were highly toxic pesticides into people's houses. And this is the massive increase, a tenfold increase in deaths as a result of that. Then these two people, the pesticide regulators, identified which pesticides were the problems and started banning them. And by the second arrow, the second ban of monocrotophos and metamidofos, there is a sudden, sustained, and really dramatic fall in deaths. This has saved about 93,000 lives over 20 years. There's about an 83% drop in pesticide suicides, and there's a 70% drop in overall suicide. Not because people don't harm themselves anymore, but because they don't die as a result. We've seen similar success from bans on highly hazardous pesticides in Bangladesh, South Korea, China. And this solution really works. Not only that, the results are rapid. We see a significant fall in deaths in just a few short years. Overall, if all highly hazardous pesticides from agricultural practice were removed, it's estimated that global suicide rates would fall from around 100,000 to 120,000 deaths a year to fewer than 10,000 deaths. That's more than 90,000 lives saved every year simply by removing these toxic pesticides from agriculture. It's an approach that's supported and advocated by the World Health Organization and was a result of a World Health Organization resolution a few years ago. Another important point to make is my team also measures the impact of bans on agriculture. And the evidence clearly shows that when these regulations are implemented correctly, there is no adverse effect on crop production. So you can safely remove these hazardous pesticides without harming agriculture. Clearly there are safer alternatives which exist, and we can remove these dangerous pesticides without affecting global food security. So in conclusion, I've stood in the hospital wards and in rural communities, and I've tried to save lives on so many occasions, and I have almost always failed. The only way to prevent these unnecessary deaths is to ban and remove once and for all these acutely toxic, highly hazardous pesticides which should never have been introduced into these communities, completely incapable of using them or storing them safely. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael Edelstone, professor at the University of Edinburgh. And now, closing our panel 2 of our conference, I would like to invite the Minister of Agrarian Development and Family Farming from the Brazilian government, Dr. Paulo Teixeira. He holds a master's degree in law and served as a sub-mayor of São Miguel Paulista, and also Secretary of Housing in the government. Dr. Paulo, he's a rapporteur for the new Civil Procedure Code, and also dedicates his life to fighting for justice for Brazil with employment and income, free from hunger, racism, violence against human, and many others. So welcome. You have the floor, Minister Paulo. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much.
Bom dia a todas, bom dia a todos. Eu quero agradecer a oportunidade para me dirigir a esse público tão qualificado nessa segunda conferência internacional rumo a um marco regulatório internacional para os pesticidas, realizado no Parlamento Europeu, em Bruxelas, na Bélgica. Quero, em primeiro lugar, cumprimentar e parabenizar os organizadores desse importante evento, a Aliança Internacional para a Padronização dos Pesticidas, IPSA, o Centro Internacional sobre Água e Transdisciplinariedade, CIRAT, a Fundação Heinrich Böll, o Ministério Público do Trabalho, o Ministério Público Federal e o Partido Verde do Parlamento Europeu. A iniciativa de reunir especialistas, representantes da sociedade civil, parlamentares e autoridades para dialogar sobre esse tema crucial é louvável e extremamente oportuna. É com grande entusiasmo que eu gostaria de lhes apresentar o Programa Nacional de Redução de Agrotóxicos, o PRONARA, uma iniciativa estratégica que coloca o Brasil na vanguarda de um modelo agrícola mais sustentável, inclusivo, saudável e agroecológico. Esse programa é parte essencial do Plano Nacional de Agroecologia e Produção Orgânica, PLANAP, reafirmando o compromisso do nosso governo com a preservação da saúde humana, do meio ambiente e com a segurança alimentar de todos. O PRONARA foi concebido para oferecer caminhos concretos para a redução progressiva de agrotóxicos. Seu objetivo é claro: substituir práticas dependentes de agrotóxicos e demais insumos químicos por soluções tecnológicas e insumos biológicos que promovam a biodiversidade, a saúde pública e a sustentabilidade ambiental. O programa estrutura-se em 6 eixos estratégicos que orientam suas ações. O primeiro eixo trata da normatização e regulação dos agrotóxicos, buscando reduzir progressivamente sua disponibilidade, acesso e uso, principalmente daqueles que representam maiores riscos à saúde e ao meio ambiente. Paralelamente, promove o acesso a produtos biológicos e naturais, que oferecem menor impacto ambiental. O segundo eixo é voltado para o controle, avaliação e responsabilização da cadeia produtiva, promovendo a integração das ações de fiscalização e monitoramento em diferentes níveis de governo, além de incentivar a participação social nesses processos. O terceiro eixo foca em medidas econômicas, financeiras e fiscais que desestimulem o uso de agrotóxicos perigosos, ao mesmo tempo em que incentivam sistemas de produção orgânica e agroecológica. O quarto eixo se concentra no desenvolvimento de alternativas aos agrotóxicos, incluindo a ampliação da produção e do uso de insumos fitossanitários adequados para a agroecologia, a implementação de práticas de manejo integrado de pragas e a criação de zonas livres de agrotóxicos e transgênicos. No quinto eixo, o PRONARA prioriza a informação, participação e controle social, promovendo estratégias para ampliar o acesso a informações sobre os impactos dos agrotóxicos na saúde, no meio ambiente e nos direitos humanos. Por fim, o sexto eixo trata da educação, formação e qualificação, fortalecendo iniciativas de ensino, pesquisa e extensão voltadas para a agroecologia e promovendo tecnologias que contribuam para a transição de sistemas convencionais para sistemas sustentáveis. O PRONARA conta com a colaboração de diversos ministérios, como Agricultura e Pecuária, Saúde, Meio Ambiente, Fazenda e Educação, além de órgãos como Anvisa e Embrapa. No âmbito do Ministério do Desenvolvimento Agrário, MDA, estamos redirecionando as linhas de crédito rural, como o PRONAF, para fomentar práticas agroecológicas, incentivar os bioinsumos e reduzir o uso de produtos de alto risco. Também ampliamos a assistência técnica e extensão rural, fundamentais para a transição de modelos convencionais para sistema de base agroecológica. Com o Programa Nacional de Pesquisa e Inovação da Agricultura Familiar, avançamos na criação de tecnologias para enfrentar desafios fitossanitários com solução de baixo impacto ambiental. Uma dessas iniciativas é a restrição do uso de agrotóxicos em áreas de alto risco, como territórios indígenas e quilombolas. Por fim, o PRONARA reafirma o papel da agroecologia como um caminho viável para superar os desafios da agricultura moderna, valorizando territórios e sistemas agrícolas tradicionais, reconhecendo sua importância para a diversidade cultural e para a segurança alimentar. Senhoras e senhores, a construção desse programa só foi possível graças ao esforço coletivo da Comissão Nacional de Agroecologia e Produção Orgânica, SINAPO, da Câmara Interministerial de Agroecologia e Produção Orgânica, CIAPO, e de organizações sociais e dos órgãos de governo. Juntos estamos criando um futuro mais justo e sustentável para o campo e da cidade. Aqui é importante ressaltar a força que o presidente Lula deu a esse tema do Pronara, do Programa Nacional de Redução de Agrotóxicos. O Pronara é mais que um programa, é um marco de transição para um modelo agrícola que respeita a vida, promove a equidade e coloca o Brasil na vanguarda da agricultura sustentável e agroecológica. Quero aqui ressaltar que recentemente nós aprovamos uma lei de bioinsumos. Ela deve ser sancionada na semana que vem e que a agricultura brasileira já está adotando em escala os bioinsumos, inclusive a agricultura brasileira exportadora se compatibilizando com as normas internacionais no que tange ao uso de agrotóxicos. Então quero agradecer, cumprimentar todas e todos, em especial uma brasileira cientista renomada aqui, a professora Larissa Bombardi, que está participando desse encontro presencialmente, e desejar muito sucesso ao encontro e às suas resoluções finais. Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much, Minister Paulo Teixeira. With his talk, he finishes our panel. Now we have two additional minutes for one question. If the audience have a question, then please stand up, and there is a microphone here that we can use for questions if you have any question. So there is a question there. Can you turn your micro on?
Yes. You hear me?
Yeah.
May I speak in Portuguese or in
As you prefer. No, better in English.
English?
Yeah.
Okay. First, congratulations for the event. I'm Glauco Bertoldo, Agriculture Attaché, the mission of Brazil to the European Union. And I just would like to know, to make a statement to separate the problems that comes with the pesticides because of the application and use and the residues that they leave in the food that we consume. So I think that's some different problems that we have to fight back, but with different consequences. And when we think about the food that we export and the food that we consume in Brazil, we can say that it is safe because Anvisa and MAPA both have programs that are verifying the safety of the food that we consume and we export, as well as the European Union tests as our deputy said, fruits and vegetables that we send to here, and we have a very few problems with that. So I can understand that we have a problem with the application and some contamination of the users of pesticides, but it's slightly different. And my question would be, farmers are farmers here or in Brazil or any place in the world, and they need alternatives. And how do you see the new law of bioinputs that Paulo Teixeira just said in this scenario, and how Brazil could help and lead the process of bioinputs and biocontrols, because Brazil is way ahead of the rest of the world in the use and develop and register of those products. Thank you.
Can you repeat your name, please?
Glauco Bertoldo.
Glauco. Okay,
Yeah.
Glauco. Thank you for your question. As I said in the beginning, this block of questions is related to panel 1 and panel 2. So the lectures, as I understood, the question from Glauco is not addressed to a specific lecture. So the lectures from panel 1 can answer as well if they feel to do it, but it's open here for interactions and also to answer the points highlighted in the question from Glauco. Quer falar, Larissa?
So there is a report from the European Commission showing the residues of pesticides found on the market here. And the samples that come from Brazil, 70% of them had some residue of pesticides, and about 8% had pesticides not allowed here or with levels of residue above of the average authorized here. So it's not me saying this, but the European Union report. So there is, in fact, there is this circle of poisoning. We cannot deny this. And I think, yes, this is the main answer to your comment.
So we were informed here that we need to stop due to the time. The translators are not here anymore. So I just would like to make some comments on logistics here. So we are going to have 3 other panels in the afternoon and also in the morning of the 13th. I would like to highlight once more that in the afternoon, the venue of the conference is going to be the European Anti-Poverty Network. There is a venue close by. It's in the Boulevard Bischof Hein 11, 4th floor. But yes, our team is here. We can give it written for all of you. So welcome to join in the afternoon. We are going to start by 3 p.m. in the European Anti-Poverty Network. We wait all of you there. Thank you so much. Okay. Hello, everybody. Just a logistic issue. We need to leave. We need to go out of the room, please.